I really wasn't expecting to have a problem quite like this. Like, honestly, Final Fantasy V is good. It's the kind of good that makes it really frustrating to write about, because what's good about it feels intuitive and clear and in plentiful supply, and outside of, like, the bizarre obligation to write about it to continue this project to its natural conclusion, there's a lingering question in my mind looking at the remaster. Final Fantasy V Pixel Remaster is a bizarre game for me to engage with. Again, as a relative outsider from the series' early era, coming in on most of their like GBA remakes, remaster, port. It's not a port if there's like new content, but it hasn't changed so much that I say that it counts. The games industry really is delightful. Anyway, I've been aware enough of the changes from one game to the other in the PR series in bits and pieces, having played a bit of the original FF1, beating all the GBA/DS versions of these titles, and it's weird coming here to this specific version of this game. So, join me for the penultimate video in the series and enjoy, because, again, you know, FF5 is pretty good. Okay, so to clear the air, because I don't want it to seem like I'm being lazy in my work here, I will explain why Final Fantasy V is good, even if I think the answers are simple. So, front and center, I think this game actually does what FF4 was trying to do by incorporating all of the elements in its predecessors into a defining title. Almost every idea at play in games 1 through 4 have a place in this one, and the changes they make to these elements pretty much work out entirely in the game's favor, which is great, obviously. To be more specific, okay, characters. So Final Fantasy IV, for example, had a massive cast of memorable and fun characters, no doubt, but it struggled to really give the entire cast a lot of breathing room in the story, which is understandable. But FF5's real benefit here is that the cast is much tighter. Your party is only Bartz, Lena, Galuf, Ferris, and later on Kryl, less than half the playable cast in 4. And FF5 is a much longer game, so you kind of sit with these Warriors of Light for a while. Like, if anyone out there has played any of like the Bravely Default games, this title is essentially the blueprint for that one, a small cast on a big journey. Where it succeeds, though, is tricky. So, Final Fantasy V, instead of going down the path of 1 or 3 with nameless parties, has gone on to make each character on your team distinct and vivid and fun, and this works hand in hand with the tone of the story, which is wild. We'll get to that in a second. Not to talk shit or whatever, but I've almost beaten Bravely Default and played a fair chunk of BD2, not to be confused with Bravely Second, a game I own and have turned on once. And there are elements between the series and FF5 that are, on paper, pretty similar. There's a sense of whimsy and broader comedic elements in both, with a more dramatic and heartfelt narrative underpinning it all. Taking BD1 and FF5 in direct comparison, you even kind of see similarities between the cast, with the usually kind of quiet, solemn lead girl and the more aggressive, forceful one to serve as a meaningful counterpart. Like, they really should feel like distinctly similar games, but outside of mechanical elements that can make Bravely Default, a chore in a lot of ways, I think the matter is one of camp. So okay, this may be where the game may not be to everyone's taste, at least while we're still talking about tone. FF5's tone is, it's very everywhere. It's arguably the start of the idea of Final Fantasy as a series that is willing to stretch its legs in, like, the tone of it. So FF1 and 3 were hard to parse, as our point of view characters were kind of just us, with a story that ostensibly had, like, highs and lows, particularly where FF3 is concerned, but we're often too focused on the mechanics and progression to really let each beat meaningfully land. 2 and 4, in contrast, definitely wanted to tell a story more than create a list of things to do, and both of those tales are kind of just consistently grim. You know, a lot of death, bombing, attacks, grim duties. They're serious tales with, like, bits of comedy kind of peppered in to cut the tension before, I don't know, like the twins turn themselves into stone, for example. So, FF5 starts somber enough, a looming threat to the world, a girl in search of her father, sure, but the game is shamelessly funny. Like, not to say it's like the cutting edge of comedy, but the game leans into the idea that these characters have a wacky, fun rapport with each other. I mean, Lena is often the straight man to the rest of the cast's wacky shenanigans, Bartz is free-spirited and a himbo, Ferris is foul-mouthed and confident, Galuf, Okay, look, this might actually be the first real defining issue between this and a game that's kind of trying to be a modern take on this. If I were to break down the personalities of the cast of Bravely Default, it's easy. Like, Tiz is serious and naive and sweet, Agnes is solemn and sad and a little uptight and proper, Ringabel is a sex predator, by which I mean he's like the anime boy flirt that never takes no for an answer, so, you know, like a sex predator, and Edea is like a fiery, angry girl. Their rapport going through the journey of the game plays out predictably there. If there's a pretty girl involved in the narrative, Ringabel will make some horrifying comment about her body, Edea will get upset, and Tsundere like storm off, Agnes and Tiz will try to reset the party, and it kind of, I don't know, always works out the same way in kind of various permutations. In contrast, while the cast of FFI has defined personalities, you know, Bart's Doobie Himbo, Lena is caring and has like a martyr thing going on, Galuf is headstrong and kind of a loud, generous gilf, I'm really sorry. Ferris is a like rough and tumble pirate lass, and I love her, and Kryl is, okay, well, by the time she joins the party, she's mostly kind of just sad. But, you know, she's pushy and precocious. Look, you get it. I just needed to say it all out. I'm sorry. The point is that they have defined personalities, but they are flexible in ways that make it easier for each of them to meaningfully interact with the story, instead of the story being served up to a preset cast of personalities to play against. I worry this is like a subtle point to make, but one of the high points is that FF5 was unafraid of having a more flexible approach to its content. In one moment, you can have Bartz and Galuf accidentally realize they're bisexual, shut up, that's how I'm reading the scene, to like a dungeon later watching as Bartz, Lena, and Ferris fall prey to a spell that traps their souls based on their affection for their respective families, where Galuf saves them through the power of having amnesia. You can be on Kazatz? I have no idea how to pronounce that name. Like, really, genuinely good luck with that. On his boat with Galuf, and, like, you know, they're trading puns with each other, and then at the very next dungeon, you get to watch Kazat die for the cause, and, actually, let's hone in on this moment. So, we have here before us a superficially similar sequence of events with, say, I don't know, the time in FF4 where Sid blows himself up helping you escape from the Red Wings. Both moments are definitely sad in their own right, but they're two pretty distinct focuses from one to the other. In FF4, your attention is drawn to Sid, someone who was in your party for a couple of dungeons, who you've probably grown like a little fond of, and while his presumed death, he's fine, should be bad for his daughter Rosa, the game's not really focusing on her as much as paying homage to the Fallen in like a broader sense. In contrast, you haven't been with Kazat for that long at this point in the story before he's already making a noble sacrifice, but he's never a party member, so the entire emotional weight of his character in the story rests on his rapport with Galuf, who at this point has been cured of amnesia and his like has this, I don't know, he has this old enduring friendship with him. This scene hits harder because instead of just feeling sad that you've lost a party member, you're watching someone you've spent a lot of time with lose someone instead. And speaking of, when the game actually makes you lose a party member, it hits much harder, like watching Galuf sacrifice himself to save the others, because, like, you've been with him through, you know, well, like scenes like that, the one with Kazat, like watching him go is tragic because it's both a sacrifice that really feels earned, and it's over a character the game has spent a lot of time with. Beyond the character work, the progression of the story, all of that, the game mechanically really refined the ideas brought up in FF3 to the point that it's an element that almost always comes up in every iteration of the job system from this point forward, and it's more what I mean when I say that FF5's better qualities feel so obvious. The decision to make a knight with white magic, to borrow an example from my video on FF3, or more likely, you know, a mime with all the free slots full of all the magic, just feels like the intuitive step to take here. This isn't even getting into the amount of iconic classes in the series like this game brings. The battle on the big bridge music, Gilgamesh in general, the time the main villain, an evil tree that turned into a warlock, gets into like a Dragon Ball Z style punch-out match with a talking turtle. Do you see what I mean by camp? Like, there's a lot of joy baked into the game, and that joy carries us through the highs and lows, even when, you know, inevitably the JRPG curse of getting later into the game and increasingly eager to just get to the end and the encounter rate was just away. Look, this game is not for everyone, but I don't think calling it one of the greats of the series is controversial. Good? Good. So the Pixel Remaster. I wanted to really rush us to this section, but I apparently had pages of praise to give to the game, which is odd, but what I wanted to talk about is what the PR changed from the various iterations of this game, which is to say, not a lot. That's not as sweepingly true. Like, obviously, the GBA version of the game, arguably its closest competitor, short of the original title, I'm guessing, it never came out to the US, and I'm still in Unit 2 in Japanese on Duolingo. Lost my train of thought. Right. Okay, so the closest competitor, again, arguably being the GBA version, is strange because it really felt more than anything like I was playing an admittedly smoother iteration of that game, minus the bonus content they tacked on. You know, Rest in Peace Gladiator, Oracle, Cannoneer, and Necromancer, the Ennio boss fight I never did, the Omega and Shinryu round 2 fights I also never did, but, you know, otherwise, it felt almost exactly the same as before. This should be good, right? Like, after all, this is a remaster. It's not here to radically redefine the game, so having something that felt intuitive and like returning to a title, albeit with missing stuff I keep promising to do one day, I swear, should be the goal. In those terms, I would say that Final Fantasy V Pixel Remaster is a seamless remaster, like in the title of the video, but by all visible accounts, it did exactly what it set out to do. The music slaps, the graphics are the same kind of like charming mess of remembering pixels and not remembering how scanlines work, whatever, 8 out of 10. But, like, that's odd, right? Like, assuming some of you have been with me from the start of this project, the FF5, the FF5 Pixel Remaster feels so smooth, like such an easygoing process to get from one to the next when that wasn't what we've been seeing, right? Like, to recap, they redid the battle system almost entirely, or as much as you can while keeping the same skeletal framework in FF1. They made an unprecedented change to the mechanics in 2, presumably in order to make it easier to play. They apparently significantly adjusted the difficulty curve in FF3 to make it less of a grind. They made arrows infinite in FF4. The point that I'm making here is that this project has the fingerprints of developers messing with their stuff since the beginning, and it's almost conspicuously absent from this release, save some very subtle changes that had to be pointed out to me by chat. Is FF5 just so much more polished a game that they didn't feel the need to really mess with it? Well, maybe, but like it doesn't shake the feeling that looking at all of these games next to each other starts to paint like an interesting picture. This is difficult to unpack in part because there's nothing outwardly wrong about this remaster, and I'm not suggesting that it should have had more intervention, but that lingering question of why remains. Why, if there's so little to be changed, did this happen? And I know the more I look into this, the more the corporate greed angle is becoming the obvious answer, but hold on, please, look, the hanging thread here comes at us from a little game called Final Fantasy V for iOS. Now, to the best of my knowledge, Final Fantasy V and 6 were the only main series titles that got this, like, iOS version. I've heard rumors that the development of these games were rushed, and I'm having trouble like finding a reliable source on that outside of the release date for FF5 happening kind of out of the blue. I don't know. People criticize these games even as they are almost full recreations of the previous versions, kind of like the Pixel Remaster here, though, you know, the iOS versions kept the bonus content. But they mostly complain about these versions because they are ugly. Their words. Apparently, the sprite design was done by the original artist for the original games, but the effect is that it looks very, very distinctly different from the original aesthetics of this game. This also happened in FF6, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The overall impression of FF5 iOS is cheap. It just feels oddly low effort, like the other two iOS Steam games that got here, like 3 and 4. Those were huge, big translations into a 3D space, different mechanics, so, you know, for these two versions to be mostly faithful recreations with, like, cute mobile games from the late 2000s kind of vibes, like, I can see how the overall effect is underwhelming. So the PRs of these versions really do have a leg up on them, in that, again, FF5 PR's aesthetics are really great. So, putting it all together, we have a game that is almost at something of a crossroads. Like, Crossroads? Did I say crosswords? I totally understand putting forward a pixel remaster with all of the intricate detail into making pixel art look like this and redoing the score as sweepingly and lovingly as they did, but this isn't just a straight-up improvement of everything FF5 iOS brought to the table, right? Besides the fact that an entire team's work at making the iOS versions have been swept under the rug so that people can buy their shiny new remasters, FF5 iOS is meaningfully different from FF5 Pixel Remaster, and here is where I predict there's a potentially thorny issue at play. Like, it is not that much of a stretch to conceive of a group of FF fans that turn their noses up on added bonus content to these old titles. Like I can feel it in the air that Cannoneer has, like, ruined the, dare I say, delicate balance of the job system? That sounds fake, because the job system was broken from the start, but, like, I'm sure that having, like, a free max damage hit button probably didn't help that either. What I'm ultimately getting at with all of this is that the argument from purity, The idea that there is something inherently better about a game that seeks to recreate the original version of itself as closely as possible is kind of a thorny issue. Like, I can't say authoritatively that the bonus content for Final Fantasy V Advance wasn't made out of, like, the pure love and desire to contribute really neat creative ideas to a game, but it's still a version of the game that exists, and, you know, before it was taken down, a version that existed with some pretty competitive pricing. And to make the call to both make a version without it and to make that version the definitive version at the expense of removing the other arbitrarily from the market feels outwardly cynical. It feels now more than ever that this game was designed to court a very specific audience, and that all of the baffling design changes from the other 4 titles before don't exist here. It feels like, short of a minimap and an auto battle and like some AI timing things, Vampire being less good, the nicer aesthetics, it feels like playing Final Fantasy V Advance again. The script is largely unchanged, and after all these months reviewing these games and being baffled by the aesthetic sensibility of them, I can finally put my finger on it. The PR series has been constructed to look like Final Fantasy V Advance. It looks like they remade 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the FF5 for the GBA's palette. The only problem with this, with how reminiscent of that title this feels, is that it feels less like getting to revisit a cool game I found behind the glass case in GameStop 7 centuries ago. It feels like Final Fantasy V Advance with less stuff. And while that less stuff was present in literally every other title in the PR series, the previous 4 titles had something that felt distinct to them, something baffling to dig into or reflect on, or an entirely new way of looking at the game if you're American and a casual and never played the original Final Fantasy III, you loser. Look, this whole thing culminates in that feeling, the one I've been avoiding, because the question I introduced months ago, asking why these games were made in this way, you know, corporate greed as an answer feels like a cop-out for a series that has doubtlessly put in tons of effort to make it look and sound the way it does. There is a passion here, but by the end of this, by our next and final video, I worry about the answer that lies before us. Special thanks to Brandon Haney, Caitlin Fisher, Colleen T, Dexter A, the literal CIA, Lewis Wells, Low Res, Maria Aladrin, Alistair V, Natalie Lane Baker, Narai the Redmarked, Pahor, Professor Popper, Saint Rawberry, Swordlocked, Thomas Wolpes, and Zetetic.